So what really is a historical martial art? Hey everybody, this is the Scholar Bing. So recently there's been a heated debate on the internet about what should and should not be called a historical martial art. And I have some thoughts on this matter that I have not seen in other places on the internet, so I thought I would bring them up in this video. So this all originally started with a video on Scholagladiatoria channel about elitism in the historical European martial arts community. And then, Scholagladiatoria made a response video, and then Shadiversity made a response video. My own video is kind of a response video to Matt Easton and mostly Shad, but I want to say a few things up front. So for one, I'm a huge fan of both the Scholagladiatoria and the Shadiversity channels, and I watch a lot of their content. It's super great. I think they've done great things for the martial arts community online, and even though I'm going to be disagreeing with some of their points in this video, I don't want anybody to take that to mean that I'm attacking them as a person, because I think that they're acting in good faith and they want to, have a real debate and discussion about what is a historical martial art. I can see where both Matt and Shad are coming from in this discussion, and I know that there are reasons why they think their interpretation of historical European martial arts is an important one and what ramifications that has. Now let's dig into the details of what's really going on and what I think we should call historical martial arts. Matt Easton argues for a more mainstream interpretation of what historical European martial arts are, and what that means is historical European martial arts are based off a manual or a treatise where you use a pedagogical text that tells you how to sword fight or how to box from the past, centuries ago, or even more recent times. And you take that text and you interpret it and you corroborate it with other types of things like material culture and remaining artifacts of swords and stuff. And you take all that together and then you produce a system based off that text. So the text is really key here, and the problem is that there are certain weapons like sword and shield or gladiatorial weapons and Roman weapons and Viking Age combat and stuff where we don't have these pedagogical texts. And according to Matt's definition, this is not really HEMA. Historians can draw upon a variety of source material whenever they're, studying the past, but one thing that they always do is they try to get a text. And the study of history is intrinsically tied to reading old texts. You might be using, material culture or artwork or something, right? But the thing that they always have is a historical book will always reference some kind of text. Now, the thing is, the HEMA manuals and HEMA treatises are a very specific kind of text. And with things like Viking Age combat, we don't have those types of manuals. But historical records still exist. Although we don't have manuals for Viking Age combat, we do have texts like the Viking sagas, which give us hints into what the combat may have been like. And the fact is that some historians study topics which are that are not present in the sources, and they have to read against the grain of the source and really try to dig to tease out any hint they can. But they still study the topic, and they also collaborate with a lot of material culture and other things. So just because we don't have a HEMA manual or a HEMA treatise, I don't think that means that we can't make any inferences about what the combat may have been like, but our picture will be more fuzzy. And the fact is that the less sources that we have when we reconstruct a historical martial art, then the more frog DNA and the more supposition we have to rely on. And a big part of the reason why Matt advocates for this interpretation that's tied to historical pedagogical texts is because the HEMA community in general is not comfortable with a big percentage of frog DNA or a lot of supposition in how the martial art works. But historians themselves do not always have texts that spell out exactly the information they want to learn. So they have to, cooperate with a bunch of different texts and try to pick them apart and see where they might line up and what can actually be inferred from the evidence present. And I think that if you have enough, different texts talking about how combat might have worked, even though they're not saying exact techniques, and if you have a lot of material culture, and if you, really dig in, you might be able to get something, but there will definitely be less certainty than with a manual. But I don't think it's entirely fair to say it's completely ahistoric just because there's no manual. I do think that it requires a lot more supposition, but it's still, they're still relying on as many sources as they have available. Shadiversity makes a very different argument. He argues that if you have an accurate replica of a historical sword, you can derive the historical system from the sword alone. He calls this the historical experimental swordsmanship theory. And what this basically means is that in the past, when people learned swordsmanship, they did not read books and texts and manuals. They practiced and they experimented on their own in their own practical applications. And this is how we can learn swordsmanship today in order to find out what they did back then. His theory is also tied to this idea of biomechanics and efficiency of movement, where people will say there's only so many ways to swing a sword, implying that, different systems across the world have reached similar conclusions and similar techniques because that's simply how combat works. I primarily have 3 criticisms of Shadiversity's argument. The first one has to do with source quality. Shad argues that if you have a sword, you can derive the system. And he kind of points to like foam swords or wooden swords or steel swords as examples of how you can do this. But I would actually argue that the more different that your sword is from the historical sword, then the less likely your system or your movements are going to look anything like what they were doing in the past, because the thing will simply move differently. So the weight distribution, the balance should all be almost identical if you actually want to even attempt to, accurately do the movement in any similar way. My second critique has to do with this idea of experimentation. Shad argues that in the past people learned by experimentation, and I actually disagree with that to an extent. People in the past definitely experimented and tried out new techniques, but I do not think that that's how people started learning swordsmanship. And the thing is, even in Europe, when you're uneducated, whenever you want to practice swordsmanship, you need to find a partner. And whenever you find a partner, there will be communities and, there will be already existing martial systems around you, and you're not just going to invent it on your own like people might do nowadays if they're just starting out, just a couple people with some foam swords or something. Experimenting in the past was also extremely dangerous. It's like, how many of us nowadays want to just grab wooden swords and try to do full contact sparring? Nobody does, because it's a quick way to get broken bones. And if you do sharps, it's even more dangerous. And the fact is that for most of the existence of martial arts on the planet, safety was not always the highest, held in highest regard, and it was sometimes dangerous to learn how to do it. So going out on your own and totally trying to experiment and try out something new is actually fairly risky. And I think that people who have already mastered an existing system would then try to, improve it and tweak it and all these things. And I think that's where a lot of these new techniques for over time come in. The third thing I want to talk about is this idea of biomechanics and sword fighting efficiently. Now, because there's this underlying supposition that if you're experimenting on your own and you're learning how to sword fight, you'll quickly realize things that do not work, and then you'll realize things that do work, and the things that do work are going to be similar to the things that worked in the past. So what are we really talking about when we say biomechanical efficiency? Because things we could do power generation or speed or conservation of energy all as different principles by which to govern our own efficient movement, and that would create very different results. And you might say, well, it's a mix of all 3. It's what will work when you're sword fighting. But even then, the problem is that there's more than one way to sword fight efficiently. And if we look at other martial arts, this is very clear. Experienced martial arts can look at certain MMA fighters and tell, are they doing Muay Thai or are they doing karate? Or are they doing BJJ or are they doing catch wrestling? The fact is that if you zoom in close enough, even though the gross motor movements and some of the basic techniques will be very similar, there will be details that will give away where they're learning it from. And that implies that there are differences in how the body can move efficiently and still overcome and successfully fight. And this also applies to swords. So if we look at the Han Dynasty Jin, which is a period that we have very little sources for and that we rely on a lot of this biomechanics to try and find a system, there's a problem in that, we could use the Jin, the Han Dynasty Jin, like we would use the Jin in the Qing Dynasty, or we could use the Jin technically as a long handle, so we could theoretically use it in a manner similar to a longsword. We could also use it in a manner similar to Italian rapier, and then on top of that, we could use it in a manner similar to Spanish rapier, which is completely different, and it has a completely different footwork system and everything. So the fact is that we could take any of those 4 different ways to use a sword and apply them to that weapon and make it work and modify things slightly, but they would still look very different. And the fact is that if you take destreza, Spanish rapier, and you apply it to something like the Han Dynasty Jin, we do not have any way of knowing if they would have done it in the past, because there's other ways that could have been efficient that were popular in that area. And just because a lot of things were tried does not mean everything was tried, and it doesn't mean a whole philosophy of system was applied to a particular weapon in the past. Additionally, even though sword fighting systems across the world will frequently share techniques to an extent, for example, most sword fighting systems, almost all that I've ever seen, will involve something where you circle down and then come back around. And this is common across almost all systems, pretty much ubiquitous as a movement. The fact is that systems also contain very idiosyncratic movements that are not found in other systems, and they may not be lower percentage, but they're still an important part of the system. A good example of this is the Bicorno in Fiore's longsword, and the fact is that this is a technique where you kind of like spinning the sword back and then changing your grip and making an awkward kind of thrust movement, and it's still a very useful and viable technique. But I've never seen anything like that in any Chinese two-handed Tian fighting or anything anywhere else. So both Matt Easton and Shadiversity make the claim that as far as sword techniques go, there's nothing new under the sun, and any technique that a modern person could think of has been done in the past. Then Shad therefore argues that because of this, any system that someone develops now while they're experimenting is a historically valid system. And the problem with this is that I think that in all of human history, certainly pretty much any technique with a sword has been tried, but the fact is that certain techniques would be isolated to certain times and places, and I don't think that every technique would be tried in a particular time and place in history. And this is particularly true of some of these more situational, unique sword techniques. For example, in small sword, there's a technique where you actually thrust behind your back as you're, guiding the opponent's thrust away from you. And that's simply something that you just do not see in like Chinese jianfa. The simple fact is that culture matters when you're talking about some of these more out there techniques. For example, in China there are certain martial arts systems which sometimes like to adopt two-handed cuts just for you're just fighting with a single hand and then you grab with two hands and you do a quick cut. Or sometimes you just like to do it a lot. But the fact is that this changed how they perceived and adapted to Western-style swords when they came in. In the early 20th century, Huang Bonian wrote a manual about how to use the military saber, like the Western-style military saber, except he did something that is very unique. And he actually trained it with two hands, where you hold like two fingers here and you have the rest of the hand here, and you could make for stronger cuts, and it could have you more strength to like push bayonets out of the way and all this kind of stuff. So it was an interesting and historically viable technique, but I do not think that in the West they ever would have thought of doing this. And we have so much documented evidence of how to use a military saber, and if you could find anything of them using a saber with two hands, I would love to see it. But the fact is that in the 18th and 19th centuries, that is simply not how Western fencing was being done, and they were was using mostly linear footwork. They weren't grabbing the sword with two hands because it was just in their minds culturally that it was a single-handed sword. So I don't think it's fair to say that anything that we come up with nowadays is something that would have been used in the past with that particular sword in that particular way. And additionally, this leads us to this problem of what do we do if we're experimenting today and we do create a system that works. You can take almost any sword, and if you know what you're doing, you can make a system that works. But the problem is that the techniques that you're using and which ones are your bread and butter techniques might be completely different from what the bread and butter techniques were in the past systems that used that particular sword. Imagine that you made a suit of armor using like a Japanese kabuto to protect your head, and then you had European plate, and then lamellar legs, and you just mixed everything together. And the fact is that yes, it's true that this is an armor that's built of historical pieces, but it's not a historical set of armor because that wouldn't have existed in the past. And I think that if you're going to experiment, there's no way to know whether or not your techniques will be in the actual system that you want to replicate. Now, me personally, I prefer to study systems which have a lot of source material, so we have a more, less supposition, less frog DNA, and we can know more about what's going on in the past. But I do think that the HEMA community can sometimes be elitist and gatekeeping, and I do not look down on people who want to do other things, but I just think that we have to be honest with ourselves about how much we can know and whether or not our system is a historical system. And that concludes my thoughts on this topic. Thank you all for watching. Please, tell me what you think down below. If you disagree completely, let me know. Just be cordial and bring evidence. I don't want to, engage with people who are just going to be shouting and not actually trying to make an argument. No ad hominems or anything like that. So, thank you all for watching. Please subscribe and don't forget to stay sharp.